Hi, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the case of Shannon Christian and Chris Newsom. And this is a case that happened very close to me. I was always very interested in it because it is a very odd case. You don't see many cases where people who don't know each other come together in this kind of way, because the victims and the murderers had no reason to be joined together. It was just an act of pure violence for violence sake. So I would like to talk about it. Alright, so we'll start with Shannon. She was a beautiful young girl, and she was born in Texas, and she moved around a little bit with her family until they finally landed in East Tennessee, Knoxville. And she was born in 1985. So she was going to high school in the 2000s. She had a brother and her father Gary and her mother Dina. Her father Gary is a car salesman in Knoxville. And I couldn't find what her mother Dina does for work, but I know the car dealership that he works at. It's not too far from where I live, so that was interesting to find out. Shannon went to Farragut High School and graduated in 2003. She was accepted into UT under, I believe, a golf scholarship. She was very much into sports, especially golf. The whole family was into sports. Her brother had traveled around for baseball, and she would travel with him to cheer him on. Shannon was attending the University of Tennessee to pursue a degree in sociology, and her family usually talks about how much she just loved people. She didn't really know what she was going to do with her degree, but she thought that maybe she'd do something involving children because she had a deep passion for people, especially children and animals. Anyone who was a little bit more defenseless than usual, she really just wanted to help those that didn't have. Both of her parents talk about how caring of a person she was, not just with children and animals, but with everyone. The people in her inner circle knew her as a caretaker. Anytime one of her friends had a breakup or a rough time in school, she would be the first person they would go to. Her mom said that she remembers one time when Shannon's best friend had gotten broken up with, and Shannon stayed up all night with her, just comforting her and giving her ice cream and talking to her, just to help her out. And Shannon not only was a wonderful person, but also very hardworking. She had 2 jobs while she was going to school full time, and she was a country girl, as you can guess, being from Knoxville. A lot of them are. So you can imagine a girl as sweet and lovely as Shannon, not to mention absolutely beautiful. She's gorgeous. So she was gorgeous, sweet, giving. She was the whole package. So when Chris Newsom met her, they really just hit it off. And they had met in November. So by the time that this had happened, they'd only been dating 2 months. But everyone talks about how much they loved each other. They just really knew from moment one they were each other's people. That's what everyone said. But let's talk about Chris. He was a Knoxville native, born here and raised here. He graduated from Halls High School in 2002. And he didn't really see college as something for him, although he was very good at baseball. Everyone said he could have gotten a scholarship. He decided that wasn't the route he wanted to take. He would still pursue baseball in his free time, but he wouldn't do it professionally. And he went on to be a gifted tradesman. And in his free time, he loved to golf. Loved golfing, tennis, baseball, fishing, everything, every sport. He loved it. And he too was quite a country person. He would always be mudding, fishing, out with his friends. Sorry, my cats are running around. Just generally a good old boy. And when you talk to his mother, she always talks about how loved he was. He was a very social person like Shannon. He had a big friend group, very large social circle, and they all loved him very much. He was still playing baseball. He was on a team called the Red Devils. So, the night of January 6, 2007, Chris and Shannon were supposed to go to a friend's party, but there were mixed tales on this. I saw a lot of information about them going to a party, but I did see an interview where Shannon's parents said directly that she was going to watch a movie with Chris and then go over to a friend's house for a moment, and then she'd be home later that night. It's a little confusing. There was maybe they did a little bit of miscommunication so that she could stay out a little bit later or something, but the parents' story of events don't really line up with what everyone else has brought forward, so I'm just going to go with what I found the most information on. So that day, Shannon had been staying over with a friend, hanging out with her all day, and Chris had been doing the same. He was out golfing. Shannon and her friend were in her friend's apartment hanging out at Washington Ridge. And Shannon was waiting for Chris to get there because they were going to go to the party together. So it starts getting a little bit late. Her friend gets a little antsy, and she asks her, "Hey Shannon, do you think it's okay if I go ahead and go? I don't really want to be too late to the party." And Shannon, being the loving, kind person she is, said, "Yeah, go ahead, I'll be fine. Chris will probably be here in a minute, so it's no big deal, no problem at all." So her friend left, and Shannon was there by herself. And then Chris showed up a little bit later. The plan was to go out to her car and she'd drive it to the party and he would just ride along with her. So she saw him pull up, she went out, he got out of his car, she got into hers, and he came over to the driver's side door and was kind of leaned down, and they were like kissing a little bit. While they were in the middle of doing this and not paying any attention because they were just having a sweet moment, a man comes up behind Chris and puts a gun to the back of his head. And he had two more men with him. The man with the gun was Davidson, because he's the ringleader of all of this, even though he tries to deny it. All of them had different stories, but they all, except Davidson, said that Davidson was the leader of this. So Davidson, Lamarcus Davidson, Latalvis Cobbins, and George Thomas were the three men that pulled up to them. And so Lamarcus had his gun to the back of Chris's head, and they forced them into Lamarcus's car. And one of the men took Shannon's car with them. But they had the couple at gunpoint, put them in their car, drove off, and they went to Lamarcus's home. And they had Shannon's SUV with them. They parked it right outside of their house, and they took them inside. Shannon called her father at 12:35 and told him they would be returning home that night, but I'm not really sure when this was. I can't get a good timeline from all of the research that I've done. I can't get a good timeline of when the kidnapping happened and when that phone call happened, so I can't tell. I'm assuming it's before they came, because I'm sure they wouldn't let her say that. I'm sure she would have been killed sooner if she would have said that. And we've got a lot of characters going on right now. We have Chris and Shannon, the victims, the three men who went to get them. That's Lamarcus, Latalvis, and George. Alright. And then at the house was Vanessa Coleman and Eric Boyd. The next part I'm going to get into, if you're squeamish or you don't like hearing about these kinds of things, I would suggest to maybe skip ahead, but I think this is very necessary to see how horrible what they went through, what really was. It's one of those things, if you don't hear it, you don't really believe how much they went through, I think. So I'm going to go through everything that I found through all the court hearings. Chris was brought into the house, and they can tell he was bound around his hands and his feet, and his mouth was gagged. And Chris didn't stay in the home very long. They said it was anywhere from, I believe, 2 to 3 hours that he was actually in the home. Chris had his hands and his feet bound and his mouth gagged. He was forced to walk on the railroad tracks behind LaMarcus's home until they found an area that they wanted, I suppose. And the autopsy report said that he was raped for approximately an hour by a man and an object. And this was around 1:45 on the night of January 6th. When the murderers finally decided that they had had enough of him, they shot him twice in the back and once in the head, with his arms tied behind his back and him kneeling on his knees. And they were behind him when they did it. After this, they burned his body. Everyone was assuming they did this to get rid of DNA evidence, which it did, because when it finally came to it, they couldn't say who had raped him or who had even touched him at that point. But we'll get more into that when we get to the trial portion of the video. Sadly, the medical examiner said that Chris's death was much faster than Shannon's. Now on to Shannon. The medical examiner said that she had suffered numerous blows to the head, bruising to the arms, legs, vaginal area, and they could tell that she was forced to perform oral sex because of sores around her mouth. Her mouth was actually cut open and bruised. She had carpet burns on her back, and they could tell she was kicked repeatedly in the vaginal area as well. They said that she could have been tortured from anywhere from 12 to 24 hours. She was raped repeatedly and suffered blunt force trauma to her vaginal region repeatedly. When the assailants finally decided they were done with her, they put a plastic bag over her head, wrapped her in trash bags, and put her in the garbage can, but not before pouring chemicals down her throat to once again get rid of DNA evidence, or so they'd hoped. Now, the reason why I haven't really talked about specifics of what the five were doing, who was doing what and who was where, is because we can't really get a good perception of that, because everyone turned on each other, everyone had a different story. It just wasn't making sense once we got into the house. Everyone said, I didn't touch them, I didn't do anything, I was the victim, I was being trapped in that house. So we don't really know who did what outside of DNA evidence, and there basically was none, especially for Chris. There was no DNA evidence for him because they had burned it all off. Thankfully, there was some on Shannon. After they had slaughtered Chris and Shannon, Vanessa Coleman, LaTalvis Cobbins, and George Thomas decide it's time for them to leave, and they go back up to where they're from, Kentucky. Shannon's parents at this time, this is Monday, and this all started happening Saturday night into Sunday, so this is Monday now. Yeah, her parents were looking tirelessly for her. Their daughter had went out Saturday night, said that she would be coming back. She didn't come back. I guess they didn't really worry too much. She is a 21-year-old, so she can probably take care of herself. She probably stays out at friends' houses and forgets to tell her parents what's going on. But when she doesn't come into work, which is really odd for her, they decide they need to start looking, and they panic and they call the police to help them. They call the phone services to see if they can trace her signal to where she's last been. They were pretty smart about it. And in their searching, they found Shannon's SUV 2 blocks from their home. And the reason they found it 2 blocks from their home is because that was where LaMarcus was. That was where this had all been happening, 2 blocks from their house. In all of this, they called Chris's parents as well to see if they would help search, and they did. They were very worried about their son too, but you know, their son's a little bit older. He has a job. He's not in school anymore. And they said he comes and goes all the time. Sometimes they don't see him for days at a time, so they weren't too worried until they got this call. They had no idea that he was in trouble. So going back to Shannon's SUV. They had found her SUV 2 blocks from their home, and as soon as they did, they knew something was wrong because she was nowhere near it. Her personal belongings were not in it. It was just there. It looked fine, but it was abandoned. So they got the cops to come check it out with them, and they had found an envelope in there, and they saved it with evidence. And that was really good police work because it actually had the fingerprints of LaMarcus Davidson on it. They got the fingerprints of the suspect. They knew which direction they were heading in. And then later on that morning, the police had found that there was a burned body on the railroad tracks. And one of the police officers was very close to Chris's father, so when he walked up and saw the scene, he said that he looked at the body and he looked into the eyes and he knew it was Chris. So immediately the police officer called Chris's parents to tell them the news. The police get a warrant to search Davidson's house, and they search out the home for 5 minutes, and they find the body of Shannon Christian in a trash can, deceased. Obviously, Davidson is arrested, but then they need to find the rest of the people involved with this, or see if anyone else is involved with this. LaMarcus tells on everyone because he is a victim, so they know where these people are. They go up to Kentucky and they arrest Vanessa Coleman, George Thomas, and LaTalvis Cobbins, and they bring them right back to Knoxville. And the last person that they found was Eric Boyd. I'm assuming that they ratted him out too because he was just in his house, pretending like he had nothing to do with it. So that was the last person to be brought into custody, but the first person to go on trial. Now the thing about Eric Boyd's trial is it was a federal case for some reason, so there's not too much information on it, but what I was able to find. On April 16th, 2008, Eric Boyd was found guilty in federal court for being an accessory to a carjacking and failing to report the location of a known fugitive. Those were his only charges. So he only got 18 years, which made the families very upset, as I'm sure you'd imagine. But because there was no DNA evidence, put him at the house. But Vanessa, LaTalvis, and George say that he was the one to drive them back up to Kentucky. And we do have proof of that, so that's all they could charge him with. And 2 years later, we had our second trial. And the one they tried first was LaTalvis Cobbins, and this was in 2009. LaTalvis's case was very odd. I watched all of the court document videos, and he was the only one to take the stand for himself and give his side of the story. And that takes 40 minutes for him to do, because I guess it takes so long for him to think up lies in his head. Not that I'm being biased, but when I went in here with fresh eyes watching him recount what had happened, I could already tell he was lying. It's not believable in the least, and it's pretty disrespectful to the family. Cobbins did not admit to raping anyone. He did admit that he was there during the raping and the murders of both Shannon and Chris. However, he couldn't do anything about it because he was a victim. He was being held captive by his brother in his house. He tried to leave numerous times, but his brother said that he would kill him if he tried. So, poor victim stuck in the house. There was DNA evidence of his found on Shannon, on her shirt and on her pants. But he had an explanation for this. He said that he went into the room that she was being held in to check on her. He was very worried about her. And while he was in there, she had asked if she could have a cigarette, and he said yes and lit it for her and put it in her mouth because her hands were bound and her legs were tied. While this was happening, she said that she would do anything to get out of the situation. She would do anything for him that he wanted. She just really wanted to live. And he says that Shannon said, "If you want me to, I will do a sexual favor for you." Shannon, the victim, had brought this up. So he said yes and received oral sex from her. That's how he said it happened. That's how his DNA got on her. Obviously, I wasn't the only one to feel like this was a flat-out lie in every way, because he was convicted of premeditated first-degree murder for Shannon and Chris. He was sentenced to life without parole, which was very exciting for the families. They thought that he had got what he deserved. They were pushing for the death penalty, but they were very happy with the sentence that he received. So the next trial was Latalvis Davidson. This was also in 2009, but after his brothers. Latalvis had concocted what he believed was a slightly believable story about Shannon, which I'm sure if you don't know her and you didn't see the way he was acting in court, maybe a believable story. However, LaMarcus Davidson, if we thought that Latalvis had really disrespected the victim and her family, LaMarcus Davidson took it a step further, or 3 or 4 steps further. Him and his defense team said that there was no evidence of all of him raping her. Even though she had lacerations to the mouth, bruising everywhere, they could tell she had been kicked and raped, and she had carpet burns on her back. There was no evidence of that, they stated. They argued that the sex between LaMarcus and Shannon was consensual. They also added that the reason that the groups, that Shannon and Chris and LaMarcus and his friends had came together, was because Shannon and Chris were buying drugs from them. Which, okay, they have no idea who these people are. Neither of them have known each other before this at all. They have all stated that. And in Knoxville, it's not hard to get drugs. It's an okay place, but if you want marijuana, someone's got marijuana that you know. It's not tough to be in your inner circle and receive recreational drugs. So that defense is horrible to me. I've lived here all my life. I know how easy it is to get something if you want it, and it's kind of sad, but that's just kind of the state of our area. So they said that the two were buying drugs, and that while they were with her boyfriend, she had consensual sex with LaMarcus, and that's why his DNA was on her clothes and her shirt and jeans. However, when he was first brought into the police station and interviewed, he actually said that he wasn't at his house the whole time this was happening. I don't know where he said he was. I couldn't find the police confession tapes, but I did hear this directly from the state in this court case, that he had kept changing this, and it started out that he wasn't even there. But he changed it 3 or 4 times, I believe. He just kept pushing the blame onto other parties. So obviously all these trials were very gruesome, because they all had pictures of the victims in it. Because I believe that if you really want to submerge yourself in what these people had gone through and what LaMarcus and his group did to them, you have to see for yourself. Well, these pictures were so heart-wrenching and violent and explicit. One of the women who work for the state side actually passed out from looking at one, and it took them a recess and they came back, but it was fine. However, the defense argued that they need a mistrial for this, because they had asked not to put those pictures in because they were too much. And that's I believe that's one of the dumbest things I have ever heard. Luckily they did not get a mistrial over this, because that's ridiculous. I didn't even know you could ask for a mistrial because someone fainted. Coming back to them, accusing them of being drug heads and trying to buy from them, they actually brought one of Shannon's friends onto the stand. She was cross-examined. When it was the defense's turn, they had Shannon's friend on the stand, and they were asking her about a pipe found in her apartment and hydros found in Chris's car. Now, I really don't know what kind of people these kids were. If they had their troubles with that sort of thing or not. Like I said, if they did, they would not have to go out of their inner circle to get what they needed for it. However, I don't feel like having a pipe in your house should give any less of a murder charge to murderers, and I don't feel that about hydros either. So, and Shannon's friend was very upset while she was on the stand. She was asked about this pipe in her house, and she said, "I have never seen that pipe. I don't know whose pipe it is." And they just kept drilling into her, asking her about this pipe. And that was just very odd to me. I don't really know what that has to do with the case. But I guess I wasn't the only one that felt outraged and confused by this, because Lamarcus was actually and convicted of first-degree murder, and he was given the death penalty. He was the only one out of all of them that had received the death penalty, and the family was elated because they knew that he was the instigator of all of this. He was the one in charge. And he was convicted of first-degree murder of Shannon and Chris, and he was convicted of raping Shannon. So the next person we move on to is George Thomas. I couldn't really get a good understanding of what George Thomas's role was in this. I am fairly sure it was George Thomas and Lamarcus that took Chris out to the railroad tracks, but I can't tell for sure because everyone was against everyone, so we can't really tell who did what and where they did it. But he would have had to play some role in it because he was in the house, and he drove to get the victims with Lamarcus and Latalvis. So we'll move on to him and his trial. Now the tricky thing about him is they have no DNA evidence against him, which means he didn't rape Shannon. He maybe didn't even touch Shannon. But since Chris's body was burned, we can't really tell what or what not he had to do with his death and rape. The state was pretty convinced that he was the one who raped and helped kill him, but they had no DNA evidence of such, so they couldn't bring anything forward that way. Since there was no DNA evidence, the state had to find another way to charge him because he was definitely there. They knew he had done something, they just couldn't medically say what. So they brought up this law that he was guilty under criminal responsibility, which I'd never heard about before this. I don't think it's used very often because everything's DNA based now, but they said he was criminally responsible for what happened in that house because he was there and took no action against it, is basically what that means. And his story, like all the others, was very discombobulated. It didn't really make any sense. He said that he actually wasn't in the car to go kidnap Shannon and Chris, but he was at the home. So he took himself out of the car completely. I don't know why, because that basically destroys his story because everyone said that he was in the car. But he said that he was at the home, and he heard Lamarcus and Latalvis come in. So he went out and he saw that they had kidnapped these two people, and he said he started freaking out and he just started chain smoking weed for the rest of the time until they had left, and he just stayed in like a dazed shock state, which is ridiculous in my opinion. And I suppose it was ridiculous in the juries too, because it only took them an hour and a half to deliberate. Because George Thomas was sentenced to life without parole, and he was convicted of first-degree murder. So family was very happy about that conviction as well. And I'm very surprised by it, honestly, because I think that's what he deserves, but I didn't know in a court of law without hard evidence you could do that. That's also another reason why these cases are so interesting, because 3 out of 5 of them have no DNA evidence and they still got them, which I don't know if that is, I don't know the legal I don't know legal proceedings too well other than SVU, but I didn't know that you could convict someone without hard evidence. I thought it was up to a jury to be beyond a reasonable doubt about something. However, that might be the case and no one really cared because of how horrible this was, and they knew anyways. It's just interesting to me. Then we move on to Vanessa Coleman's case, which was very odd since she was the only female there at the time. Also, she was a lot younger than all of them. George, Latalvis, Lamarcus, and Eric were all mid to late 20s, and she was 19. So she was very young to be in that situation. And she was also dating Latalvis. That's why she was there with them. They were dating. And I'm fairly sure Latalvis was 24 and she was 19. It's a bit of an age gap for them. And there definitely is a power dynamic in that. The defense in Vanessa's case was that she was just like Shannon and Chris. She was a victim in this, which at first glance is kind of easy to understand for me, because she is a very young woman in a house with people that have guns and they just kidnapped people. I'm sure that's something that sounds realistic. However, there was some things that made her story a little shaky, such as the fact that she would cook them breakfast every morning, not just cereal, but like eggs, bacon, oatmeal. She'd cook them breakfast every morning, which was 2 mornings. Also, they found a diary of hers that was written one day after the incident, and she talks about how awesome her day was. I've read over it a few times, and the gist of it is, I have such an interesting life. You guys would never believe how much fun I am having in the big TN. And she just talks about everything like it's absolutely normal and she's living the best days of her life. But this was literally the day after the murder of Chris, and I'm pretty sure while Shannon was still being tortured. So after the jury saw that, they couldn't really believe this victim mentality anymore, because she said it herself that she enjoyed being there. So they were shown her diary, they were shown all of the evidence against her. However, there was no DNA evidence. So this leaves room for reasonable doubt. And because there was so much reasonable doubt, they were not sure if she had helped in the crimes or not. They deemed her guilty of facilitating the crimes but not committing them. So she was there, she could have helped Chris or Shannon, but she didn't. She chose not to. And that gave her 15 to 25 years in prison, which the families were very, very unhappy about. But they went back to the courtroom, and the jurors had finally settled on what they were going to charge her with.
She should be in life without parole, but we'll take 53 years.
Should have gotten the 77. The judge said himself that there is no sentence good enough.
And they had settled on giving her 53 years. With the facilitation of rape and murder and all the other charges, that's as high as they could get it, because they were not sure if she helped in the rapes or murders, but she definitely facilitated them, they believe. So she was given 53 years, which the families liked a little bit more, but obviously was still heartbreaking to them. The judge that was presiding over all of the 4 cases, discluding Eric Boyd, which was a federal case, but Richard Baumgartner, which was over the cases of Vanessa, LaTalvis, LaMarcus, and George. It was found out that through the proceedings of all of their trials, he had been high on prescription pain meds that were given to him from someone that had went through his court before. So not only was he high, he was also taking advantage of someone that was going through the court system for using drugs improperly. So after he was kicked out, obviously for that, Knoxville got a new judge, Judge Black, and everyone was getting really angry that there was going to be a retrial, because legally there should be after that. I mean, they obviously did not get a fair trial if the judge was high the whole time. And Judge Black agreed with that. It's their right to a fair trial, no matter how horrible they are. So I'll give a short rundown over these trials because they came out basically the same. The first one to go on retrial was Vanessa Coleman in 2012. Her trial was moved outside of Knoxville to a jury that didn't know anything about or knew very little about her case prior. And they still found her guilty for the facilitation of murder of Shannon, but not Chris. Chris was left out of this trial. They kind of phased him out, and she didn't receive any charges for him. And that dropped her sentence from 53 years to 35. However, when I watched the videos of the families after this retrial, they do not seem too upset. Even Chris's family said that that day was about Shannon and Shannon only, and Chris will receive his justice in time. So, she had already served a good amount of time, so she could be getting out in the near future if she behaves herself. And in 2013, George Thomas had his retrial. George Thomas was the man that had no DNA. While LaTalvis and LaMarcus had DNA on her clothes, George Thomas had no DNA anywhere on either of them. So as you can imagine, this was difficult for the state to overcome once, but now doing it once again was probably going to be even tougher because it had been so many years later. They have to look into this again. They have to get all the evidence again. I'm sure sitting in storage evidence becomes a little different. So they were going through this again. Since there was such uncertainty, even with numerous people from the house saying that he was one of the men to take Chris out to the railroad tracks, they could not say for sure. And I'm sure George Thomas was not too happy with the outcome of his retrial, because on the first one he was sentenced to 1 life sentence, but in this trial he was sentenced to 2 life sentences plus 25 years, locking him away forever and a day at least. So the family was very pleased about that. George Thomas had his case in 2013. Right now it is 2019, and LaTalvis and LaMarcus have not had their retrials yet. Now I saw there was an article written in 2013 that said LaTalvis was trying to get his retrialed, but I haven't heard anything about that since. However, LaMarcus, he also put in to get his case retrialed. And January 29th of 2019, he actually went in to plead his case in order for the judge to appeal it. But as of right now, about 2 months later, I have not seen any new information. I keep looking for new information on this, and there hasn't been anything definite said about if he will or won't receive a new trial. And on to the last one, Eric Boyd. So Eric Boyd was the man that was dealt with in federal court, and he was eligible for release in 2022. That's what his original sentence would have gotten him to. However, in 2018, the Knoxville Grand County jury decided that they had made a mistake, and they were going to give him a retrial as well. When they came back and said, "We're giving you a retrial," they decided to indict him with first-degree murder charges and first-degree premeditated murder charges. And originally, his new trial was set to start on January 3rd of 2019, which would have been a few months ago by now. However, with so much evidence on this case and so much for the defense and state to gather, they have set the new trial date of August 5th, 2019, which is not too far away. That's where we are at this point. I'm interested to see if Latalvis and Lamarcus get their chance at a retrial, because I do think it would be fair that they do legally. However, I really don't think it would bring that much of a difference. We know what they did. We know that they're guilty. It's kind of a waste to retrial, but in the eyes of the law, it is necessary, I think. But this was a very big case to go over. So many people involved in it. It was just such an odd case. Like I said, it's one of those things that reminds me of the Manson murders, because it's just so random and needless and violent, just violent for violence sake. And I think if they hadn't gotten caught, they would have done it again and again. Maybe not this group together, but Lamarcus and Latalvis and George, at least, I think they would have gotten together again to do this if they had not been caught. Yeah, it's just a truly sad case. And even when the family gets the verdicts that they want, there's really no silver lining to it. It's just one of those things that happened in a place where I grew up that's really upsetting to me, because I know that we have a lot of things go on here, very serious things like drugs, human trafficking, but we never have anything so blatant as this. And to be raised at a time where this happened and the trials and everything were going on, it's just kind of odd and unsettling. But thank you for watching. If you've watched to this point, I hope you learned something. And enjoy the rest of your day. Hopefully, if you can, after hearing all of this. It's probably going to be hard. Yeah. Bye.